problem my clients are facing currently, and I'll just drop in what I do in my day-to-day practice, is that they collect vast amounts of consumer data or online behavior. And how do they do that? By means of cookies. And currently there is no other means for doing that than by means of cookies. If technology would come so far that we have other tracking instruments, which there are, but there are device fingerprinting, and it just falls within the scope of the cookie regulation just as much as cookies, although my clients prefer to disagree with me on that, we have the same problem. So I'll take you back to what is my challenge for today. First, I'll introduce myself, and it was already a good presentation, but I'll explain to you why I think I'm asked today, and that is because I advise a lot of clients on their big data projects. Because I encounter a lot of clients who say, we want to go and do big data. And then I have a question mark on my head, and the first question I ask is, what do you mean by big data? Because for a lot of my clients, it's just simply entangling or combining simple databases. For instance, their online behavior with their customer database. That's for some clients already big data, while for other clients, it's very complicated, and the presentation of Max just elaborated on that. It's very complicated mathematical, strategical analysis, which I don't even understand. I'm a simple lawyer today, and that's my role also today. So for me, big data differs to the client I'm advising on. And why do I put and privacy challenges? Because I was already, challenged by the speech that Max gave. He already encountered as one of the dangers of big data being privacy. And I hope that today I can show you that it's not a real danger. It's a challenge which you need to tackle when you go and do big data, but it's not actually, it can be a dangerous trick, but it's also, you can tackle it. When I was starting the presentation, I thought, what is big data? And Max already, as you say in Dutch, he molded some of the grass in front of my feet, because I have the examples here, the vast amount of data which we combine every day by usage of Facebook, Twitter, Google. A lot of people are less using Twitter and Facebook, but we all are vastly using Google. We all have our mobile phones with us, and that provides vast amount of data because it tells a lot of companies in the world where you are, what your contacts are, what your address details are. We have a lot of Wi-Fi tracking. One of the examples is, which was Schiphol was contemplating when you go into Schiphol. They wanted to go and track whether you were using Wi-Fi to calculate the time you were spending between the moment you were actually accessing Schiphol and the time of your departure. Because they have key KPIs with the service providers at the airport. And if they're not performing well, there are penalties on that. But how can Schiphol measure that the company is actually delivering, that you go through security in a number of minutes that is calculated for it? By Wi-Fi tracking. The financial transactions, we all know the story about ING and how the personalized advertising within ING was, a PR disaster, I can call it. But don't be naive, a lot of banks are doing exactly the same, although they are not selling their free space for advertising purposes, but they're all analyzing what we buy, when we buy it. If we buy a house, they also want to provide us with insurance policies, and they're allowed to do that. And how do they do that? By analyzing our data. The Internet of Things, we all have the card holding up, the RFID tags, but I think you all know the concept of the smart toothbrush and the smart vacuum cleaner. There was a program this weekend on the smart energy meter, which was supposed to be privacy proof. But surprise, surprise, the data is going to be sold to third parties, which wasn't the original plan, but the energy providers think it's a very commercial, smart idea to sell that data. And then the e-governments, because our government is an owner of vast amount of data. They have the ambition to provide us with open data, which can be bought by or even purchased by private companies, which they can combine for their own analysis. So what's then new about big data? Because we know there are huge piles of data that have been existing for a number of time. Well, I think from a legal perspective, I see some difference occurring, and that is the data storage. In the old days, every company had its own service. Now, we all invest in cloud solutions, and that means that the data is stored in the cloud, and for a cheaper price, we can store more data. We have a, expanding possibility to go from unstructured data to structured data, and the mathematicians among us can better explain it than I can, but I've understood that through algorithms, we can also make smart calculations, as we've just also seen in the video. And there's the new possibility to make cross-references, to see links between data we didn't know before. But then, as I've already said, in the debate about big data, privacy is often cursed and is said, well, we can't do this big data project because of privacy. And then I get a little bit angry because then I say, why can't you do it because of privacy? Well, just because. And I say, well, that's not an answer. Provide me a good answer why we can't do it because of privacy. Well, what I want to do today is take you through the privacy challenges I see, and you can add some at the end of the talk by your questions. But first of all, the privacy challenge I see is identifying what is the origin of the data. Because a lot of companies have specific databases. Some are purchased from third parties. Some are their own databases. Well, when it's your own databases, it's often from own transactions from your customers, or it's collected online through the means, of cookies. I can't make it otherwise. Or collected via sensors, the RFID or other sensors used. And then you've got the vast amount of data sources from third parties. There are all kinds of commercial parties today who are offering very interesting data sources. And I just have one warning for you. If you purchase this data, please read the little letters in the contract. Because they often stipulate limitations to your use. It's a one-time off use. It can only be used for limited purposes, and so on and so on. For instance, the Chamber of Commerce is a well-known public source, but it puts very, very strict or stringent conditions to the use of that data. Then the second challenge, and there I want your help again with your flag red or green cards. The people who were telling me that they're using data, how many of you are working with personal data? And if you're hesitant about what it is, then... Okay. So you can leave it. So it's 50-50, I think. And some people... Who doesn't know what personal data is? Everybody. One. Good. One person. Two. Okay. Well, then I first take the step. If you go and do big data, and from my perspective, it's crucial to know whether you're actually processing personal data or no. You're processing data that we've all seen, but is it actually personal data? And then the question mark raises, but what is personal data? And according to the definition, it's any information relating to an identifiable or identified natural person. I'm not going to bombard you with all kind of legal language today, or at least I'm going to avoid it, but this I can't do without. The simple examples of personal data are someone's name, someone's address, someone's postal code in the Netherlands, your digital photo, the cookie with the unique number. Your IP address is considered as personal data. Your surfing behavior. Who of you have an iPhone? Your iPhone has a unique number on it. That's called the UDID. And that's also considered personal data. The ones of you who have Wi-Fi at home and have a router, the router has a MAC address together with the location, is also perceived as personal data. From my talk already, you see that the definition of personal data is a very broad one. So if you go and do a data processing, it's crucial to first identify, is actually personal data involved? Or is no personal? For instance, I know the example from Nedap with the measurements of cow production or milk production. Well, you can surely state that if it says nothing about the farmers who own the cows, that the mathematical figures about the cow milk production has nothing to do with personal data. So what is the boundary then between personal data and no longer being personal data? They're no longer being personal data, is anonymous data. What is then anonymous? That is when you can reasonably no longer link that data to an identifiable or identified person. And a lot of discussion is currently going on, because I challenge you to read some of the privacy statements online. Go to Bijenkorf tonight, go to the Telegraaf tonight, go to some big US sites, and just to challenge me, read the privacy statements and you will find their statements saying, we don't process personal data. For instance, also Google Analytics, one of the biggest analytics providers in the market today, says, we don't process personal data. We only process anonymous data. And I, frown then and think, I don't think that is correct. Because as we've just seen, it's very easy to simply identify a person again. So for data to be truly anonymous, I don't have the clear-cut answer. It will be depending on the circumstances, whether you aggregate, you delete some data from the data set, you hash in combination with other measurements to come to anonymous data. Well, then you've got a second category, and that's in between. That's in between personal data and anonymous data, and that's pseudonymous data, all these crazy words. And that is used in the processing of medical data. That's where you split the name of a patient from its medical results. Then, research will be done on the medical results. You can go back to the patients once you have found results, but within the research, there's no link back to the identifiable person. On the processing of personal data, the set of rules, which I'll explain today, will apply. On the processing of anonymous data, the set of rules won't apply. That's why it's so crucial to know whether you're processing personal data, yes or no. On the set of pseudonymous data, the set of rules will apply, but there will be a lighter regime applicable. I won't go into the details, that's far too far-fetched. Well, then the third challenge already. I know that I'm processing personal data within a big data processing. Then the question is, who is actually processing? Because I'll show you the big data landscapes and all the parties involved. I think it's crucial to know who is actually the addressee of all the rules and regulations. Is that me, as for instance, the Bijenkorf who is ordering to do a track and trace system? Or is that the provider of the track and trace system? Well, if it's your own data processing and you do it for your own purposes and with your own means, then you are the data controller. And you provide the instructions to do the data processing, then you are the addressee and you need to comply with the rules. If you're hiring a third party to do part of the data processing on your behalf, you're a data processor. And there is a tricky part. A lot of data processors aren't located in Europe. They aren't located in Europe, but they're located in the US, especially analytics partners. They're located for a vast amount in the US. So data's going to go from Europe to the US. Specific rules will apply. Then there is the fact, and you see that an awful lot with the US analytics partners, that they want to use the data that they collect, for instance, on Nedap's behalf, for their own purposes, for their own research, for combining reports for their other clients, like, for instance, Google Analytics. Google says, we will analyze your website for you, but we will also use that data to combine reports for our other clients, including your data. All that, the specific limitations, must set out in a data processing agreement. That's not the case today. When I go into companies, and there is an investigation by the Dutch Data Protection Authority, the first thing they ask is, are there data processor agreements with the service providers you hire? And then I see a question mark on the company saying, we don't have that. We didn't know that was obligatory. We don't know even that need to exist. So that's the landscape. So if you hire parties, you need to figure out whether it's a data controller or it's a data processor. Most of the parties which are mentioned here will be acting as data processor. And you need to have arrangements in place. Then the fourth challenge, and then we get to the nitty-gritty detail of why big data could impose a privacy risk. The mere concept of big data says that you want to keep as much data for as long as possible because you don't know the relevance of the data today or in the future, which might be unrelevant today, can be very, very relevant in 10 years' time. So you want to keep as much as possible for as long as possible. But there is the concept within the privacy rules and regulations. It says you need to keep as little data as possible and only the data that is necessary for achieving the purposes. So you have the principle of data minimization in the privacy regulation. How do you combine the two? Then there is the danger of data storage worldwide. You don't know where, and because of the cloud, it goes from one country in one day of one side of the world to the other side of the world for cost effectiveness. You have no predefined purposes. According to our privacy regulations, you can only process personal data with predefined legitimate purposes. With big data, I don't know where I'm going to process the data today or tomorrow. I just want to have it and see it going along, why I want to use it. You have no ground for processing. For instance, you should have obtained consent. You have no consent. Then there is the problem, you have vast amount of data. Is it adequately protected? There is the possibility of data breaches. This is a gloom story, really, if I tell it like this, but I'll tackle you through it. And then there's the right to be forgotten. We had today a talk during lunch. For instance, a consumer knocks on the door and says, I want to be deleted from all systems. How do you do that? Is it even possible? And how do you do that execution of rights? And then there is the danger that it's absolutely untransparent what you do in a big data processing, and there's the risk of discrimination. As it was mentioned, the insurance company, which involves in big data project, and then there's a difference in premium for healthy people and unhealthy people, for instance. Well, the question is then, how are you going to limit? I said, well, there are privacy risks, but how can you limit that? And I've tried to make some practical guides today, to make them as practical and as low-key as possible, but I am a lawyer, so sorry for that. What I said is, if you go and do a big data processing project, you make a privacy impact assessment, and you try to make privacy, well, an essential part of your big data processing. What is that privacy impact assessment? Well, it's simply a step-by-step plan in which you're going to analyze what data you're actually processing. What is the nature of that data? Does it include financial data, medical data, children's data, because that's also considered very sensitive data? What is the manner in which you're going to collect it? Are you going to do it by yourself? Or are you going to engage third parties? And how are you going to combine that data? Then try to define the purposes of the big data processing. And I know from my experience that is, if I tell this, then every data analyst starts glaring at me and saying, but I can't. And I say, well, then make a business case. Even when Google invented Google Street View, they knew what they wanted to do prior to collecting the data. They knew they wanted to build a system by means of which people could see the streets based on the map. Although they started collecting the data without informing people, without telling them, oh yeah, by the way, we're taking video footage and pictures of all your houses, but later on they only explained. And then the Dutch DPA, the Data Protection Authority, said, yes, but you should have offered an opt-out. You should have offered people the possibility to state, I don't want that. But that was only after they had collected the vast amount of data. But the purpose for which they wanted to collect the data was already known years and years before. So that's why I say, go from fiction, I want to do a big data project, to reality. What is your business case? Why do you want to collect and process the data? Then we get a little bit into legalistic, I can't say the word bullocks, but I can't make it different. There is this obligation based on the law that you have to have a ground for processing. And that's where I also get to the cookie consent. Because from a legal perspective, the whole cookie circus, as we can call it, was that there need to be a different ground for processing or for collecting the cookie data, and that is consent. And that was why we all now need to click on the annoying OK buttons and I agree buttons. From a processing perspective, there is the same problem. You need to have a ground for processing. And that can be consent, and we see from a European perspective that, for instance, for profiling, the legislator says more and more we need to ask for consent. Don't ask me today whether I agree with that strategy, because I don't. I don't think that consent is a holy grail. I don't think that all people understand why they are consenting. But you do need to analyze what is your ground for processing. There are 6 possible grounds. I'm not going to tell them all to you today, but there are 6, and you just have, with a lawyer together or with your legal team, sit together and say, okay, what is going to be my ground for processing? Then there are some risks. There is the risk of data maximization. There is the risks of unlimited storage. But you have to have a good story. For the DPA, for the Data Protection Authority, if they come in and they ask you, why are you keeping the data forever? You can say, we're only now combining or collecting data for the last 2 years. That's not a huge amount of time, but you have to have a good story. You can't just say, well, it might be interesting just one day, and we don't know yet. Then security measures, because you're keeping vast amount of data in various databases owned by yourself, by third parties all around the world, security is become a more and more primordial object. And the reason for that also being is that in due time, which isn't that far away, we expect it to be this year or next year, there's going to be a new obligation to notify the DPA and even citizens of data breaches. So this means that if somebody sits in the train and has a USB stick with him with all your customer data, loses it on the train, you not only have to notify the DPA saying, oh, we lost that USB stick, but also if there is customer data and it might infringe the privacy of those customers, you have to go to them and say, oh yeah, sorry, I was stupid, I left a USB stick, and you now have these and these trouble. We've seen the cases from, I think it was Sony. We all know the big cases, but there's been research saying that every company encounters data breaches, and you need to be prepared for that. You need to have procedures in place to tackle those. And with big data, that's an even bigger risk and challenge. Then there is step 6. You have all these customers, you have the data of them. How are you going to inform them? And that's also a little bit of a curse. You have that very famous privacy statement at the footer of every web page, and I challenge you there. There is this very nice text stating, what are you doing? But you need to update that. A lot of companies I encounter, when they say, we want to go and do big data, I say, well, you already have specific purposes for which you're processing. Oh, do we? Where can we find them? Well, you have your own privacy policy. Oh, that's true. So that's not like only a legal document. That actually needs to reflect reality. For instance, I represent a lot of big publishers, and they're all very interested in doing big data for personalized advertising. Well, just mention that in your own privacy statement. Be honest about it. Then the fact of how can a data subject execute his right, and that mythical right to be forgotten. The right to be forgotten doesn't exist actually today, apart from what we see now, the deletion of search result in Google, but it will be existing in the near future. So a person has a right to come to a company owning its profile saying, delete my profile. You need to have procedures in place how you can do that. How can a person execute his access rights? And then last but not least of all the challenges, create privacy awareness. Don't see it merely as a danger, saying we can't do big data because of privacy, which I really, really hate people saying. But there is 2 things which are very necessary. You need to get the direction and higher management on board, because some difficult decisions will need to be taken, And you need to have dedicated teams which combine the intelligence of IT, security, legal, and data analysts. I think that challenge together can also tackle the privacy challenge. That was it for today. Any questions?